Hello, today we're going to be doing a microeconomics essay on migration to the UK and the labour market. The reason why I've chosen this today is because in the scheme of work in the previously tested areas, migration and the labour market have been under-tested, and so we think that it might be an area that could come up, so it's worth targeting. Please take a look first of all at the data that I've put on the right-hand side of this essay. We can see certainly that migration from the EU is falling, and non-EU migration, however, is rising. Net migration overall from the EU particularly is falling. And we're going to base this essay on the agricultural industry. You could take a quick read of that. That puts it into perspective just how important migratory labour is, or immigrant labour is for the agricultural industry. Right, now try and think about what your 2 points would be there. My definitions so far are net migration and an effect on workers, firms and consumers. So you might think about how to put those into diagrams and how you could evaluate those points. Okay, pause the video and come back. Right, these are my two diagrams. I've got one labour market diagram and a diagram to show the effect on the profits of a firm. Notice that I've been quite specific with my diagrams in that I've got agricultural workers, I've got quantity of grapes, I've got grape farmers here. So I'm making it very specific, something that's a very good technique that you want to use in micro. Our first area is the effect on workers. Pause the video, think what you can get from the diagram on the left. Okay, coming back. This is quite a quick diagram because it's only a supply and demand diagram after all. We want, again, to be looking at the two equilibriums, and we've got that there. We want to be saying, and the key part of this essay is really to say that lower net migration affects the supply of labour. There are more workers leaving from emigration, and there are few workers arriving from immigration, and therefore overall the supply of labour to the grape picking industry or the agricultural industry will fall. We might make a bit more of this and say that actually this industry, as we saw from the text, is very much dominated by migrant workers. It's an industry that is low paid. The quality of work, the working conditions are relatively low, and therefore local workers tend not to want to do this. The lower net migration is coming from Brexit, possibly the pandemic, lots and lots of issues there, but particularly Brexit and a lower exchange rate as well, meaning that it's less rewarding for workers from abroad to work in the UK. As a result, the wage rate will rise to WR2, and the real income for grape pickers in the UK will be rising as well. So if you want to get into grape picking, maybe now's the time. Right, let's look at the evaluation. A very good evaluation to this is the wage rate elasticity of demand. You might have noticed that in my diagram I've written or I've drawn the demand for labour very inelastic. You might want to think about why that is. Think about that, pause and then come back. Right, well, we've got a few reasons as to why that might be. And ultimately, if you want to evaluate the shift in a supply curve, you can then use the elasticity of demand to show what the effects will be. So if you've got a demand shift, you can use PES. If you've got a supply shift, you can use PED. It's the opposite curve which determines the exact proportions of the changes to price and quantity. Now in the labour market that's no different, but instead of using PD and PES, we're using the wage rate elasticity of demand and supply. So this ultimately then will depend on the wage rate elasticity of demand for grape producers, and now you want to show your knowledge of wage rate elasticity of demand. We can say that that could be inelastic due to the fact that we might be hinting that capital cannot replace labour easily. Now, that may not be the case in the long run, but certainly today a reasonable argument could be that it is difficult to replace labour for capital. And if it is difficult to replace labour for capital, then the elasticity of demand will be more inelastic, remember, if we can immediately replace labour, then our demand for labour will fall, and we'll switch over to capital using machines to pick grapes instead. So we could say that. Now, you don't have to know that. You may argue it the other way and say, well, actually, with new technology, with robotics and automation, it may well be possible to pick grapes without labour, although ultimately that will depend on the relative price of that capital, the cost of that capital compared to a worker. And that's something that I don't know and you don't know, and that doesn't matter. Ultimately, we're just going to make the argument, and that will be enough to demonstrate our understanding of the topic. As a result, the demand for workers would have there'll be a lower percentage decrease in demand for workers than the increase in the wage rate. And ultimately, that would be beneficial for workers. Workers would experience a significant increase in their wage rate. You'll see limited unemployment in that industry. And for those workers who are still in the UK, well, that's very good for them. However, there are multiple reasons why you might have a wage rate, an inelastic wage rate elasticity of demand. It also does depend on, and I don't know if this is taking the point from our next point, and we might delay this, but it's certainly true that it depends on the price elasticity of demand for grapes. Now, assuming that we cannot transfer over to capital-intensive production, I can't replace labour for capital, we know from the diagram that firms will be facing higher costs. And the only real way that they can deal with that, they could absorb it themselves if they already had supernormal profits. But the other way would be to pass on those higher costs to the consumer or to the supermarket or whoever they're selling the grapes to. But we might argue about this and say, well, there's probably a large number of close substitutes to grapes. I could imagine that French grapes or Spanish grapes would be very similar, or if not better, than British grapes. And therefore, if you are going to increase the price of UK grapes, then we may just move abroad and buy them from there. In which case, the UK grape farmers may not have the ability to raise prices and pass on that increase in cost to the consumer. I'm going to refer to that in our next argument as well. But it does affect the wage rate elasticity of demand. If you want to learn more about that, go back to your notes about that area of the course. Right, our next area to think about is the effect on firms and consumers from this diagram on the right hand side there. Pause the video, see what you can get from that, including an evaluation. Right, coming back, again, this is very standard initial position and what is happening. We know that the higher wages increases the variable costs, and that's going to shift the MC equals MR. MC equals MR is the area that we then tend to forget very easily. So MC1 equals MR to MC2 equals MR. You want to be picking out all of the quantities, the prices, and the supernormal profits as well. We could make the point then that supernormal profit will fall for grape farmers. Could you make the point that they're less dynamically efficient? Well, possibly. I don't know how dynamically efficient a grape farmer can be. They may well be investing in new technology and new capital, irrigation systems, for example, greenhouses. Give specific examples of how they could improve their productivity and the type of capital that they could be using. You can make that up, but be specific. You want to be using your application of this industry throughout the essay. We could push it a bit further though, because again, this point is relatively short if we're going to do a 2-point essay. So we may also refer to the consumers here and show that consumer surplus has fallen from this box, this overall, this amount here, and it has fallen down now to XEP2. So XEP2. So we've got a smaller overall size of the consumer surplus. Again, that consumer surplus diagram, that consumer surplus triangle tends to be less used in the cost revenue profit diagram. So it's something that you can get out of that as well. Quite useful. There you go. The two areas are shown there. Now, it may have a regressive effect as well, given that lower income consumers may well be purchasing a greater quantity or as a proportion of their income, a larger proportion of their income spent on agricultural products. Right, evaluation. Well, think about what you can get from that. How could you evaluate that? Pause and come back. So we could, a very easy standard evaluation whenever we're talking about cost changes is to look at, well, what percentage of the costs of this firm are made up from this particular area. So that comes back to the labour intensity of the industry. How labour intensive is it? How, as a percentage of their costs, how high are wages as a proportion of their costs? And if it is labour intensive, it's likely that labour will be a high percentage of their costs. Remember, they also have other costs like fertilizer and all the other equipment they're using and capital. But if that labour is relatively important as a cost, the magnitude of the overall cost increase will be large, demonstrated on our diagram by a significant shift in the curves. And I would argue that that's probably likely to be true in the fruit picking industry. It does seem as though it is quite labour intensive and they're having to employ a lot of workers. We've got from the text 50,000 to 75,000 workers alone. So that seems to demonstrate that it is pretty labour intensive. We might also come back to this idea of the elasticity of the good. And if we argue, and I know that this is a slight repetition, so I think perhaps it's better to miss out the argument above, but if it is true that it is relatively PD elastic and there are lots of close homogeneous substitutes, even there may be superior substitutes from abroad who have better weather, then you could argue it's PD elastic, in which case the rise in price as a result, if you make the curve more elastic, the price rise will be limited. There'll be a significant fall in quantity demanded, and local UK farmers may leave the market and we may substitute and switch over to other areas, for example, going to Spain or France or other areas of the EU, dependent on transport costs and dependent on the difficulty of exporting from those markets. You could also talk about, if you went further, wine producers and anyone else who are using those grapes as well. They may also be affected as well. In judgment, it's likely, given the numbers that we can see, the fact that so many of the workers in the fruit picking industry are migrant workers, it's likely to be a very significant negative impact on the industry as a whole. It is dependent on government policy, so the government is talking about having certain visas which allow fruit pickers to come on a seasonal basis. So if that were to change, we would see a different outcome. It's certainly also impacted by the exchange rate, and that exchange rate being relatively weak recently does mean that fruit pickers' salaries in foreign currencies have gone down as well. So there's a double blow. There's a double blow to the incentive of wanting to come to the UK. And ultimately, it does depend on the capital intensity, whether you can switch workers' labour for capital, something that will become easier in the long run. And so you might refer to, in the long run, it's likely that fruit pickers could be replaced entirely to get it completely altogether anyway. And it also depends on the availability of the substitutes in the market. And we know that agricultural goods are highly available, often quite homogeneous, and so therefore the impact is likely to be particularly significant. And don't hold back when you're on a judgment. Do say very specifically, come down the line and say that this is going to be bad. And I think this is one of those examples where you can't beat around the bush with it. You need to say this is a significantly negative impact. One thing that does just occur to me before we end is that this could also be a paper 3 essay, a micro and macroeconomic effect. If you got that as an essay, I would use the macroeconomic point as growth, and you can talk about the consumption that comes from the wages of those workers in the UK, and having all of those workers going back to their own countries might result in AD shifting to the left. You can also talk about LRAS as well. You can talk about GNI. You can talk about whether they repatriate their wages anyway as well. So you can easily turn this into a paper 3 essay, and I would say that's probably quite a likely area for them to be asking about in paper 3. Okay, thank you for listening.